You mentioned one of the things here is that only 7 local authorities, I believe, actually collected ethnicity data on those responsible for child sexual abuse, and therefore we've been reliant on, and they did so because they didn't want to stir up community tensions. Well, I'm afraid this stirring up community tensions is not what this is about. This is about
absolutely.
But the problem comes when one party, one ideology, one dogma, one system controls the discourse or weighs in on it. That's when you stop being objective and start to play God. And that is what is happening around the world. Out of political correctness or virtue signaling or being co-opted by Islamists, journalists and politicians are scared to talk of Islam or Muslims, their practices, or indeed when Muslims perpetrate criminal acts.
Former GOC 15 core is also with us, and Bob Blackman, member of the UK Parliament, with us also. Namaste, Jai Hind to everybody. Thank you for your time. First to Bob Blackman itself. Bob, my first question is on the case report that came out. A lot of questions have been raised. This happened 2010 and even earlier, but it's taken a while for British authorities to not just to get to the bottom of it, but also to acknowledge that this is a serious problem. Your reaction?
Well, obviously, this is something that I was involved in on my select committee over the last 14 years prior to the general election, where we investigated the child sexual exploitation of young girls in Rotherham originally, but then extended to other places such as Rochdale and other parts, particularly of the North of the Midlands, where unfortunately, very sadly, young white British girls were literally ruthlessly exploited and by grooming gangs. And we had, at the time, we heard from the survivors, we heard from the victims. We also heard from Dame Louise Casey, who, of course, has just done this most recent report. Originally, the last government obviously had the Professor J report, which listed recommendations to be undertaken. What happened, and we've got to be clear on this, is that as a result of the J report, then a task force was set up, and as a result, more than 600 people or men were arrested and have been going through the courts since then. A lot of these cases that we're hearing about of criminal gangs that are now being sentenced for their crimes were caught by this process. So this has been going on for a long time. My former colleague, Anne Cryer, called this out back in 2003. So this is something that's not been happening just recently. This has been going on a very long period of time. And I think one of the biggest problems we've had in British society is the almost refusal to recognise the main perpetrators of this evil. And therefore, as a result of which, then this has been allowed to continue for far too long.
Well, but you spoke about the J report, you spoke about the Casey report. There is also this independent report of July 2022. That's the Telford report, which was an independent study that said that nearly 1,000 children could have been exploited in Telford, in that region itself, between 1989 to 2017. That's a big number, and that this phenomenon is still on. Now, is it because British authorities, leaders didn't want to call out the ethnicity, worried because of a backlash, or is there something else which is systemic? Because even cops have come on record saying largely the arrests have been people of Pakistani origin, their ethnicity. Bob?
Well, there's two things. One is that obviously we've had, over the period of time that you mentioned, successive grooming gangs who have been brought to court. They've been found guilty. They've been sentenced to prison. Some of them, of course, have subsequently been released and go back into the community from which they came, in the same towns, which is, in my view, an outrage. These people should have been, in my view, they should have been deported. They should cease to be our nationals and indeed be deported back to Pakistan. And unfortunately, we've got a problem with human rights legislation, which is in some ways interfering with that process. So this has been a problem, and also, if I can say as well, we've got huge examples of young Indian girls, Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, being exploited by these grooming gangs as well. So it is not confined to young white British girls. It is also to those of Indian, Sri Lankan and Bangladeshi extraction, as well as possibly Pakistani extraction as well, that have been abused in this way. So what we've got to do is not only catch the perpetrators and punish them accordingly, but also get to the bottom of why it is that these men think it's acceptable to do this. That ethos is not acceptable in this country, nor should it be acceptable in any country at all. But clearly, there is an ethos that exists in amongst these men in the circles they mix in, to believe that it's perfectly acceptable to do this to young white British girls. And clearly, that is not acceptable. Full stop.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, you mentioned one of the things here is that only 7 local authorities, I believe, actually collected ethnicity data on those responsible for child sexual abuse, and therefore we've been reliant on and they did so because they didn't want to stir up community tensions. Well, I'm afraid this stirring up community tensions is not what this is about. This is about identifying these evil perpetrators.
Absolutely, and they are evil wherever they are, Pandit Satish Sharma. Why should, and this has happened across 50 regions in the United Kingdom, and Bob is saying that only 7 of them collect the ethnicity data of these perpetrators. Namaste, good to have you on the show after a while.
Namaste, Jai Shri Ram ji. My compliments to Bob also. He's one of the few parliamentarians who has been walking this walk alongside our community for a long period of time. Bob has mentioned Ann Cryer. She was actually talking about these issues 40 years ago. And I would just take your memories back to a time when the police abandoned the rights and the needs of Hindu girls and Sikh girls, so much so that there were riots in Southall and in Slough, physical riots, because the community had to resort to its own protection. At that time, the police were very high-handed and in their approach that this is just a problem amongst these dark people, we'll just let them get on with it, this is what they do. Now, Bob and I tried to address this issue over 7 years ago when there was a meeting that we called in Parliament, and Bob was very kind and courageous to host it, in which this issue was raised by Mohan Singh, was giving documented evidence of many cases where this was still going on. This is only 7 years ago. And I invited Tapan Ghosh to provide the evidence of the data of the same phenomenon occurring in West Bengal, and he provided that data. The consequences of holding that event in Parliament, Bob really took a lot of criticism and a lot of heat, as did I. But now it's going to be established that, in fact, we were ahead of the curve. Right. To show you and to demonstrate for you exactly how deep this problem is, I would invite your researchers to offer money to Labour parliamentarians to come on your show to have this conversation. Okay, and if you offer them a substantial amount and they come on, I'm sure we can fundraise and we will pay whatever it is you charge them. They won't come on this show and they won't talk about this issue. When Baroness Casey's report came out, you know, the first thing that struck me was Baroness Casey has now joined the far right. Because she said, I am raging inside of me with what has happened and what is continuing to happen. Now, that's exactly the response that Prime Minister Starmer did not want to see, and that's what he used as evidence of the far right, that the far right are going to respond with anger and rage, and we must protect this vulnerable community from being tarnished and their name being sort of associated with this thing. Keir Starmer, I think, has actually destroyed the confidence that the British public has had in the British state, and it's gone to a level which is beyond recovery, if you ask me. You know, there are a couple of things that have happened. Baroness Casey's report, she is providing exactly the same information and presenting the same conclusions that Tommy Robinson was doing 20 years ago. This is the nature of the British state, and the long-suffering British public have had enough. If you have a look at the Twitter spaces that are being held, the comments that are being circulated, the meetings that are being called, and the response that's happening, there is now zero tolerance for the excuses that this government is going to be putting forward. And that is a devastating set of circumstances. Let me make one more small observation. Baroness Casey said that this report is not the new inquiry is likely to conclude in 3 years' time. Okay, 3 years' time is another 3 years too long. This is the straw that's going to break the camel's back. I ask you, and I'm sure Bob may have an opinion, a report is presented, the findings are presented in 3 years. There is an election coming along 2 years, and even that is questionable with this current government. They are tampering with the roots of democracy at such a level. In 4 or 5 years' time, just before a general election, a Labour government is going to come up with some sort of a solution which is going to identify that the party itself, the parliamentarians themselves, that the bureaucracy itself, that the civil servants themselves, the police authority, the councillors have all been complicit as either enablers or they have been abetting and aiding or accessories after the fact to over 1 million individual criminal acts of abuse against young girls. Can there be anything more heinous? The global status, I don't think this, one last thing, Anand, I don't think this government has understood that this is now an international issue. When Elon Musk tweeted and brought this attention to brought this to the attention of the global community, suddenly there is a new spotlight on this country. I don't think that the government have understood that this is no longer something that can be just sidestepped like it has done in the past.
1 million cases is not something which a nation like the United Kingdom should look the other way. And, Dr. Ranganathan...
Let me be very precise. 1 million individual criminal acts, in excess of 1 million, because many of these poor young girls had a criminal act inflicted upon them repeatedly by 40, 50 men at a time, many, many days at a time. And each and every one of those actually is a criminal act. Yes. And we have a young lady who, in a moment of outrage after the Southport massacre of 3 beautiful young girls, tweeted something, she regretted it and deleted it, and she's serving 31 months in prison for one potentially criminal act of public display.
So she is serving 31 months, but these perpetrators have not yet been, arrested. They have not been identified, named, and they have not been classified. Dr. Ranganathan and General Pandey. I've limited time, so quickly. Yes, please. General Pandey. Dr. Ranganathan.
Yeah, no, first of all, let me just say that I have nothing but appreciation for Bob out here, who's done a yeoman's job for bringing this whole atrocity out. So thank you, Bob, for doing this for everyone around the world. It needed to be brought out. Having said that, I hope you take it sportingly. But I dare say, Anand, even Bob is not unaffected by the political correctness that unfortunately shrouds us, because in the 3 minutes that he talked about a lot of important stuff, he talked about the ethos, he talked about the psyche, but he did not mention what is the reason for that ethos that is allowing these gangs to do this. What is the dogma that is sanctioning them, this grooming? So I want to go a layer beyond just the crime, because I don't want to discuss the crime. I want to discuss the psychology that allows this crime to happen. And truth be told, Anand, we are living in a world where you believe what you see. But unfortunately, what you see is written by those who see what they believe. Objectivity has become that metallic object that must be left behind before you pass through some electronic threshold. The biases don't beep anymore. We are a deeply polarized society, a deeply polarized world. This isn't objectionable, because polarization means you have a clash of ideas, that there is competition among them, and so it mirrors Darwinian evolution, science, religion, capitalism, communism, right wing, left wing. There's nothing wrong in professing diametrically opposite likes and dislikes and views, even if you hold entrenched views. But the problem comes when one party, one ideology, one dogma, one system controls the discourse or weighs in on it. That's when you stop being objective and start to play God. And that is what is happening around the world. Out of political correctness or virtue signaling or being co-opted by Islamists, journalists and politicians are scared to talk of Islam or Muslims, their practices, or indeed when Muslims perpetrate criminal acts, for fear of being branded Islamophobic. In fact, the irony is, it is the Muslims who are Islamophobic. That is, they fear Islam. They fear to bring out the orders and the commandments of their holy book in its entirety on Jews, Christians, polytheists, homosexuality, apostasy, heresy, dress code, wife beating, blasphemy, because they fear being called illiberal. And this is what we saw in Britain, when mass child rapes resulted from grooming of underage girls at the hands of Muslim gangs for years. But the police and the politicians not only turned a blind eye, they accused and shamed the victims and their families. Anand, we are living in an age of wokeism, victimhood, selectivity and political correctness, and I don't know if you're allowed to tell the truth anymore. And away from Britain, just 30 seconds, we have seen the very same perfidy being played out in India. Remember the horrendous Ajmer grooming case that was hushed up? Remember cases of love jihad that continue to be hushed up, continue to be called figment of one's imagination by journalists and opposition? Love jihad is a reality, Anand. Let me be very clear. Impersonating someone else's religion for the purpose of entrapping a woman or coercing her to change her religion for the purpose of marriage or for living out peaceful married life are criminal offenses. For the leftists and the logically challenged, most often one and the same thing. The means do not justify the end, where the end is an interfaith marriage, which by itself is a wonderful thing. Now you can bunch these three offenses under any phrase. Love jihad, groom jihad, it doesn't matter. What matters is, do these offenses happen? The answer is yes, by the hundreds.